the cause of all distress, the reason in which we have lost connection to our eternal, blissful nature, is that we are identifying with this body and this mind as being ourselves. This is the root cause of all suffering. Janasya moho yam aham mameti. When we think in terms of I being this body, and our mind, our senses, our homes, our families, our wealth, our creative abilities, when we think them to be mine, that is the root cause of the hard knot of material bondage, which forcibly casts the soul into the repetition of birth and death, and subjects that eternal blissful soul to the pangs of the threefold miseries of material existence. To identify with the body of mind is the only cause of suffering. No one can be satisfied by identifying with the body of mind. But the illusion of Maya perpetuates a condition where we are striving to become satisfied through identification with the body and mind. It is a great perplexity. We find a little bit of satisfaction, which is actually of no substance at all for the soul. But under illusion, we think there's some little satisfaction when our mind or senses are in connection with a apparently pleasing object. But actually, as Krishna says in Gita, Yehi samsparashaja bhoga dhukajonaya evate atyantavanta konteya nate shuramate buddha. That this is the sign of less intelligence, because the objects of the senses are the sources of all pain and suffering, because they are temporary. We become attached without real fulfillment, and even that little bit of an excuse of fulfillment, that artificial imposition on our mind or senses that the sense objects create, we become so attached because we're so hungry, we're so thirsty, longing for spiritual pleasure. We can't live without it. So we become so endlessly attached to a little mirage of pleasure that just touches our mind or senses for a few moments only. You can imagine how hungry we are for Krishna, how much longing we are for pleasure, if we can experience any satisfaction at all for such a poor excuse for the real thing. Just like if a man is tremendously seeking the pleasure of a woman, or a woman is seeking too much the pleasure of a man due to uncontrolled mind and senses, sometimes just the thought of her name or a sight of her picture gives some little excuse to think, oh, some pleasure. It's not the real pleasure. But because there's such a deep attachment to the real pleasure, some little tiny excuse, which really is nothing at all, seems to give some relief. In a similar way, we are so much longing to be reunited with Krishna and find the bliss of Krishna consciousness. We're so much pleasure seekers by nature as spirit souls, part of God, who is the reservoir of all pleasure. Even the foolish, illusory objects of pain, which apparently give a tiny idea of pleasure to the mind or senses, we become so much attached to it. We have to hold on to something. If we can't find the real thing, we'll attach ourselves to any little excuse which has any semblance of the real thing. That is Maya. Because Krishna is all attractive. And Krishna explains all beautiful and wonderful things in this world are just a spark of my splendor. So it's simply because this material world is a perverted reflection of the glory and beauty of God. Just an infinitesimally tiny, small reflection, pervertedly manifested of Krishna. But even that gives us so much sense of relief and satisfaction because we're so much hungry for the real thing. But the problem is that as long as we remain attached to the infinitesimal, illusory, perverted reflections of Krishna's beauty and grace, we cannot put our consciousness on Krishna. To the degree we are attached to the perverted reflections, to that degree we cannot connect our minds and our senses and our hearts to the real source of all pleasure, Krishna. Therefore, attachment to the satisfaction of the body and mind is the cause of all bondage and illusion, and it is the only thing that's keeping us away from our true, eternal, loving relationship with God. Bhagavan Sri Krishna.
You were listening to Radhanath Swami on devotionalnectar.com.